He didn't raise his voice when he said it. That was the part that stayed with me, that we were standing in the driveway of my parents' house, my suitcase already in the trunk, my future folded into neat plans I was afraid to say out loud. The sun was going down, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete we'd stood on 1,000 times before. My father crossed his arms and looked at me like he was bracing for disappointment. "You'll forget us when you succeed," he said. "Not if. When." The sentence hung between us, heavy and unfair, like a verdict that had already been decided. My mother stood behind him, silent. Watching. Always watching. I laughed awkwardly, waiting for him to smile. To admit it was a joke. He didn't. "I won't," I said quickly. Too quickly. "I'm not like that." He nodded slowly. Not convinced. "That's what they all say." They all. I felt something twist in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but confusion. Because all I had ever done was stay. Stay close. Stay careful. Stay small enough not to threaten the family balance. I had turned down opportunities because they were too far. Delayed decisions because the timing wasn't right for everyone. Dimmed excitement because success made people uncomfortable. And still, he was certain I'd abandon them. What they didn't know, what I hadn't said out loud yet, was how much effort it had taken just to stand there that evening without shaking. They didn't know what I had already done. The offer letter was printed and folded inside my bag. Signed. Final. The job wasn't just a step up. It was a door out of a life where my dreams had always been treated like a threat. But instead of congratulations, I was being warned. My father sighed and looked away. "Just remember where you come from," he added. "Don't get too big for us." Too big. That phrase followed me like a shadow. I hugged my mother goodbye. She held on a little too tightly, like she was afraid letting go meant losing something she couldn't name. As I got into the car, my father tapped on the window. I rolled it down. "You think success makes people generous," he said quietly. "It doesn't. It makes them forget." I swallowed. "I won't forget you." He straightened and stepped back. "We'll see." I drove away with my hands clenched around the steering wheel, replaying his words over and over until they felt less like concern and more like a prophecy he wanted fulfilled. What I didn't realize then, what would take years to understand, was that his fear wasn't about me forgetting them. It was about me outgrowing the version of myself they were comfortable with. And as the road stretched out in front of me, dark and open and terrifying, I made myself a quiet promise. I wouldn't forget, but I also wouldn't stay small just to prove him wrong. Because sometimes moving forward looks exactly like leaving behind the expectations that were never meant to hold you. And my father? He had no idea how literal his words were about to become. Guilt has a way of traveling faster than you do. It rode with me the entire drive to my new apartment, sat quietly in the passenger seat while I unpacked boxes, and slept beside me those first few nights when everything felt unfamiliar and too quiet. Every achievement came with a question attached. Should I call home? Am I allowed to enjoy this? What will they think if they see me now? I spoke to my parents often at first. Too often. Long phone calls where I carefully edited my life into something small enough not to alarm them. I told them about the workload, not the pay. The stress, not the opportunity. The long hours, not the doors opening. I learned quickly which details made my father quiet. Any mention of growth. Any hint of momentum. "So you're busy now," he'd say, voice flat. Or, "Must be nice to have so many options." I told myself it was just adjustment. That once they saw I was still me, everything would settle. What I didn't realize then was that I was still trying to earn permission to move forward. I flew home for every holiday. Took the red-eye flights so I wouldn't miss work, then pretended I wasn't exhausted. I bought thoughtful gifts and downplayed their cost. I listened to stories I'd heard 100 times, because listening was easier than explaining. My father watched all of this quietly. One evening after dinner, he said, "You're different." Not accusing, not approving, just observant. "I've grown," I replied. He nodded slowly. "That's what worries me." I laughed it off. I always did. But inside something cracked. Because growth wasn't rebellion. It wasn't betrayal. It was survival. And still, it felt like a test I was failing. As the years passed, the calls became less frequent. Not intentionally, just naturally. Work demanded more. My energy became finite. And every time I missed a call, I imagined my father's voice in my head. "See? I told you." When I finally moved again, this time for a promotion I didn't tell them about until after it happened, the guilt was heavier. You should have asked us first, my mother said. Asked, as if I needed approval for a life that was already unfolding. I apologized anyway. What I didn't realize then was how deeply I had been trained to apologize for momentum. The first time I couldn't make it home for a holiday, my father didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just said, "I guess work matters more now." The words were calm. The implication wasn't. I spent that holiday alone, staring at my phone, wondering why success felt lonelier than struggle. Because struggle had been shared. Success was happening without them, and that made it suspect. I started withholding good news entirely. Promotions, raises, recognition. I told myself I was protecting them. But really, I was protecting myself from disappointment. Because every milestone seemed to confirm their fear instead of easing it. What I didn't realize then was that my father wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of becoming unnecessary. And no amount of reassurance could fix that. The turning point came quietly. A phone call I missed because I was in a meeting that would shape the next decade of my career. I called back an hour later. No answer. That night, I received a message. "Don't worry. I know you're busy now. We won't bother you." I stared at those words for a long time. Something hardened in me. Not anger, but resolve. Because I saw then what I hadn't been able to name before. No matter how small I made myself. No matter how much I stayed. Moving forward would always look like leaving to them. And if that was true, then maybe it was time to stop apologizing for it. I didn't stop calling. But I stopped chasing reassurance. And that quiet shift, the one they never commented on, was the beginning of something that would change our relationship forever. Because guilt can only control you as long as you believe it's justified. And I was finally starting to question that belief. Distance doesn't announce itself. It grows in inches. In missed calls that don't get returned right away. In conversations that stay polite but never go deep. In updates that feel safer unsaid. I noticed it most in my father's tone. He stopped asking questions. Not because he wasn't curious, but because curiosity required engagement, and engagement required acknowledging that my life was moving in directions he couldn't guide anymore. When I spoke about work, he responded with short affirmations. "That's good. Sounds busy. No follow-ups. No interest in the details." At first, I filled the silence for him. I talked faster. Explained more. Tried to translate my world into something familiar. Then one day, mid-sentence, I stopped. Because I realized he wasn't listening to understand. He was listening to endure. What I didn't realize then was how exhausting it is to keep someone comfortable at the expense of your own growth. The visits home changed too. The house felt smaller. The conversations shorter. I no longer knew where to put my ambition without it knocking into old expectations. At dinner, my father talked about people he knew who had lost themselves chasing success. He never said my name. He didn't have to. My mother tried to smooth things over, always had. She asked about my health. Whether I was eating enough. Whether I was resting. Never about my goals. Never about what excited me. It was safer that way. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, my father sat with me in the living room. The TV was on, muted. "You don't need to prove anything," he said suddenly. "I'm not," I replied. He nodded, unconvinced. "Just remember, work won't be there for you when it's over." I looked at him then. Really looked. And for the first time, I saw the fear underneath the warning. Not fear of me failing. Fear of me not coming back. "I'm not leaving you," I said quietly. He sighed. "That's what scares me." I didn't understand that at the time. What I didn't realize then was that my independence made him confront his own limits. And that's not something everyone can do with grace. Back in my own life, things accelerated. Responsibilities increased. My name started carrying weight. People sought my opinion, my leadership, my presence. I was becoming someone, and it was happening whether my family approved or not. I called home less often. Not as punishment. Not as rebellion. Out of self-preservation. Because every call required emotional translation, reassurance, and restraint. I still showed up when it mattered. Birthdays. Emergencies. Milestones. But I stopped narrating my journey. Silence returned. Not the silence of guilt this time, but the silence of boundaries. And boundaries feel like rejection to people who never needed them before. One afternoon, my father finally said it out loud. "You don't need us anymore." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, and in it I heard loss. "I need you differently," I said. He didn't answer. That was the moment I understood something painful and freeing at the same time. I couldn't move forward and stay frozen in their expectations. Something had to give. And it wasn't going to be my future. Because what I didn't realize then, what would take years to fully understand, was that distance isn't always abandonment. Sometimes it's the space required for both people to breathe. And whether my father could survive that space was something neither of us could control anymore. The call came on a weekday morning. My phone lit up with my mother's name while I was reviewing documents at my desk. I almost let it go to voicemail, not out of avoidance, but habit. Work had trained me to stay present where I was. Something made me answer. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, her voice tight. "No," I said. There was a pause. Then she read my name aloud, slowly, like she was testing how it sounded outside of a family context. "They mentioned you," she said. "On television." I closed my eyes. The announcement had gone public that morning. A major milestone, one I had known would shift things, but hadn't anticipated this kind of quiet. My mother kept talking, filling the space. "Your father's watching it now," she added. He didn't say anything. That silence was louder than any accusation he'd ever made. I thanked her and hung up. For the rest of the day, messages came in from colleagues, partners, people I barely knew. Nothing from my father. When he finally called that evening, his voice was different. "Careful." "I didn't know," he said. There was no anger in it. No warning. Just fact. "I told you before," I replied gently. "You didn't want to hear it." He didn't argue. Instead, he said something I never expected. "I thought if you succeeded, you'd forget us." I waited. "I was wrong about that," he continued. "You didn't forget. You just outgrew the version of us that needed you to stay small." The words landed heavily. Because for the first time, he wasn't defending himself. He was admitting something. "I didn't know how to be proud without feeling left behind," he said quietly. I felt my throat tighten. What I didn't realize then, I thought, was how much courage it takes for a parent to say that. We talked longer than we had in years. Not about work. About fear. About aging. About what it means when your child becomes someone you can't guide anymore. "I didn't want to lose you," he said. "You didn't," I replied. "I'm still here." But even as I said it, I knew something had changed. Not broken. Changed. The next time I visited home, the house felt the same, but the air didn't. My father listened when I spoke. Really listened. He didn't interrupt. Didn't redirect. At one point, he said, "I didn't know how hard you were working." I smiled sadly. "I tried to tell you." He nodded. "I know." That was enough. He didn't suddenly become expressive. He didn't praise me loudly. But he stopped warning me about success. He stopped framing my growth as a threat. And that was more than I had expected. What I didn't realize then was that sometimes people need proof before they can let go of fear, even when that proof costs years of closeness. I didn't forget my family. I didn't abandon them. I simply moved forward and waited for them to decide whether they'd walk beside me or stay behind. And my father? He finally stopped bracing for loss. Because he realized something important. I wasn't leaving. I was becoming. My father never became a man of big speeches. He didn't suddenly start bragging. Didn't introduce me as proof of anything. Didn't post articles or frame headlines. Instead, he changed in smaller ways, the kind that don't make noise but alter the room. He stopped correcting me. Stopped offering warnings disguised as wisdom. When people asked about my work, he didn't deflect or minimize. He simply said, "She's doing well," and let that be enough. At first, I waited for more. Some explicit apology. Some acknowledgement of the years of guilt. Some version of I was wrong. It never came. And for a while, that disappointed me. Because part of me still wanted the moment where everything was named and resolved. What I didn't realize then was that my father's language had never been words. It had always been behavior. The first time he asked my opinion on something important, not family, not tradition, but his own decision, I froze. "What would you do?" he asked, eyes steady. It was such a simple question, but it had never been asked before. I answered carefully. He listened, and when he followed my advice, something in me loosened. Not because I needed to be right, but because he trusted me. At a family gathering months later, someone joked, "Careful, she'll forget us all one day." My father didn't laugh. "She won't," he said calmly. "She knows where she comes from." I looked at him. He met my eyes and nodded slightly. That was his apology. What I didn't realize then was that reconciliation doesn't always sound like remorse. Sometimes it sounds like respect. The guilt I'd carried for years began to fade. Not all at once, but steadily. Like a weight being set down piece by piece. I stopped editing my life when I spoke to them. Stopped softening accomplishments. Stopped bracing for disappointment. And nothing terrible happened. My parents didn't disappear. They didn't withdraw love. They adjusted. Slowly. Imperfectly. But honestly. One evening, my father said something that surprised us both. "I was afraid you'd forget us," he said. "But I forgot something too. I waited. I forgot that raising you meant letting you go." The words stayed with me long after the call ended, because in them was everything he'd struggled to say for years. What I didn't realize then was that his fear had never been about success. It had been about relevance. And relevance, when you're a parent, shifts whether you're ready or not. I didn't forget my family. I didn't replace them with ambition. I didn't leave them behind. I moved forward and gave them the chance to move with me. Not on my timeline, not on theirs, but in a way that didn't require either of us to shrink. And that, I've learned, is the quiet version of love. The kind that doesn't demand sacrifice. The kind that doesn't mistake growth for abandonment. The kind that finally understands that success doesn't erase roots. It proves they were strong enough to hold. Moving forward didn't look like distance anymore. It looked like balance. I no longer rushed home out of guilt. I no longer delayed decisions out of fear. I no longer measured my progress by how comfortable it made others. And in that steadiness, something unexpected happened. My family relaxed. Not because they controlled me again, but because they no longer needed to. At dinners, conversations became easier. Less loaded. Less coded. My father asked about my work with genuine curiosity now, not suspicion. My mother stopped worrying aloud about whether I was doing too much. They had adjusted their expectations. And I had adjusted mine too. I stopped expecting them to understand every part of my life. Understanding isn't required for respect. What I didn't realize then was how much pressure I'd placed on all of us, trying to make growth painless. Growth is never painless. It just doesn't have to be punishing. The final shift came quietly. One afternoon, my father handed me an old photo, me as a child, standing in front of the house, smiling like the world was waiting. "You were always like this," he said. "Always looking ahead." I smiled. "And you were always watching." He nodded. I was afraid of what I couldn't follow. That honesty was enough. Because I no longer needed permission. I had earned my peace. And my father? He had earned his. By letting go. I think about his words sometimes, the ones he said in the driveway. "You'll forget us when you succeed." I understand them differently now. They weren't a curse. They were a confession. A fear wrapped in authority. I didn't forget my family. I didn't trade them for ambition. I simply stopped carrying their fear as my own. Success didn't take me away from them. It revealed where we needed to grow. Some people think moving forward means cutting ties. For me, it meant redefining them. I learned that love doesn't require proximity. It requires honesty. And honesty sometimes needs distance before it can return as trust. My father and I don't talk every day. We don't need to. When we do, there's no tension. No warning. No guilt. Just two adults, connected by history, not trapped by it. I didn't forget where I came from. I just refused to stay there. And that made all the difference. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.